I have to say that my strongest objection, and I would have liked to have done this in a different way, and why I was prompted to file this particular amendment here, was that we have all been listening to, on an institutional front, the frosty relationships between the legislative leaders. And I know many of us came in here with the expectation this week of actually doing a lot more overrides and not necessarily doing a sub-budget. And that is because the legislative process is set up that we contribute and debate and send a budget. So does the Senate, and we send along to the governor, and he gives his input, and he gives a stamp of approval or not with recommendations, and then we have an ability. Each one of us has an ability through a vote and through the legislative leadership's direction, if not prompting by members, to bring up an issue and to cast a vote on it. Now, I'm not going to be the first person to get up here, and as long as this institution has existed, and say, I don't understand what it's like to be on the winning or losing side of a vote. Matter of fact, I know precisely what it's like to be on both sides. But I live with it. And I understand that I have to make my explanation sound and rational to the people back home. And on an institutional front, though I respect that many people have given all kinds of accounts to the legislative leaders and how now this supplemental budget shows great progress, that everybody's talking and we're on the right road. Some people would call that progress, but I'm sorry, Governor, I call that interference. And I call it interference because what should have been a vote in a veto form is not happening. And perhaps all of this was done behind closed doors to come up with a consensus, and that might be construed as progress. I don't consider it that way, because I was prepared to either go forward or not go forward, be on one side or another side. So this is a different vehicle to do that. And because of that, the only way to really speak about this, other than to speak about it at the end, and I talked to a few people in hopes that I could speak with the Speaker about it, wasn't able to do that, but the only other way to do that is to actually file an amendment. So the amendment before us does this. And there were two other amendments that follow after this, because I thought it was important to give my colleagues a choice, since we weren't given necessarily a choice of how this was going to evolve, even though many of us anticipated we would have vetoes that we would have to make very difficult decisions about. I accepted that responsibility, and I wasn't going to shy away from that responsibility. But this amendment in particular calls for sustaining the veto that the governor had put in, sustaining a veto that has actually not been the first time in which this particular line item in previous budgets has suffered significantly and still been able to manage and survive. It would restore the original intent that the legislature had, and we all took that vote, folks. We sent the governor a budget that had a certain amount, and we also expected the governor to weigh in and then have an opportunity to rebut it. But I guess the governor has found a different way to work with legislative leaders, and that is through a sub-budget, and so we don't need to do that anymore because they've decided what the compromise is. So unfortunately, this particular amendment is asking a hard question to some. And that question, without those people who have a zoo or not a zoo in their district, and I'm somebody who happens to have that, is the difficult question of, do you restore that by just putting it in a sub-budget without having to ask for a two-thirds majority to do that? And in this case, that is what the case will be. The other two amendments that I won't speak on, but were to follow, give varying options to colleagues. And I can understand why you may not want this option, but you might think of another particular option. And the final option being to actually come up with a plan that shows a defined date of removing fiscal dependency to this particular entity, because we have been promised that in the past. And this is no different. I want people to understand this is no different than any other transparency and accountability item, I think, that I've spoken on that relates to difficult decisions we have to make and the expectations that we should be placing on those entities to come back to us and show they actually are serious. And not just serious based on their numbers, but to come up with a critical plan for phase-out. And I know I'm going to hear potentially about a plan that has been put in place since 1992 and that we keep moving in the right direction, and this is kind of normal for those people who have zoos that are accredited. It's not normal necessarily to be being subsidized at 60% when you're not the only zoo in the state, and other zoos that comparable, if not larger scale operations, can do it for less without some of the other items that might be folded in with a subsidy that allows them to do something very different than the private sector. But you may hear those arguments, and for that I respect that. I just know that in my district, this is an important issue. It's an important issue in which even the zookeepers who might be concerned about animals had offered and said, I don't think that the Commonwealth or anybody else would ever let anything happen to those animals. And we have many competent professionals that would never let what was put in the newspaper ever transpire. And even those people who are in the legislative front would never let that transpire. But I'm a great believer in being able to fund at a certain level with accountability and also reporting back to us. And that, my friends, has nowhere to be found in this supplemental budget language. And so to offer first that you don't fund it at all in terms of restoring the $2 million that the governor asked us to hold out on, and moving it to a direction to partially fund that discrepancy, or also moving in the direction to ask for accountability, there are several options. And you have to be the judge on which option, if any, that you would think would be important to you. I just know in terms of fiscal responsibility, I have a difficult decision to make. In terms of equity, of having a zoo in my district and a family of constituents I know it affects, and also institutionally looking at it from the perspective of how we're actually doing this and not being able to do it, I think, in a venue that would afford even greater accountability and make those people who are dependent on that money come to the table once again with notions of phased fiscal withdrawal and be serious about it, and not just hope that people forget since 2003 to now where we're in 2009. Hope we forget that history. So I don't say that lightly, and for that in particular, I would ask that members think about this seriously, and they think about supporting it not only on the merits of how it impacts them, but how it may also impact their district. And in my case, in terms of fiscal responsibility, equity, and institutional inclination, I felt that I could not support this provision that's in the supplemental budget, and I ask members and colleagues to support this particular amendment. And when I ask for that support, I ask for it to be called by roll call, the ayes and nays. Thank you.